The Wyoming Council is actually headed up by Scott Christie, who I think most of you know. Scott Christie is the only paid staff person that is directly involved in the Wyoming Council of Trout Unlimited. And this is just a brief rundown of what the Wyoming Council does. Its mission, you can read it, I won't read it again. Big part of Scott's job is chapter support. And we strongly believe that our council is only as strong as the 12 chapters around the state. So Scott does a lot of his efforts are spent supporting chapters. Aquatic invasive species legislation, that's kind of high on our priority list right now. I was just talking to Kevin about it with the new bill going through the budget cycle. Hopefully those inspections will be moving to ports of entry, and we're certainly in support of that. Adopted trout, you all know about that. I mean, you've got one of those here in Dubois. Incredible program. I don't even know how many schools it's in right now. Probably about 5 or 6 across the state. We do have a Cut Slam fundraiser coming up this summer. Just simply is an opportunity for people to come and get all 4 species of native cutthroats in the state of Wyoming in one long weekend. And we put on kind of like an outfitters camp. We set up big wall tents and great big stoves, and we cook semi-gourmet meals and try and get our participants to Cut Slam. Last year we had 3 participants. They all got their Cut Slam, although it was pretty tough. The waters were cold and high, and it was tough. We ran it a little too early. And then on our conservation agenda is Yellowstone Lake, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. By the way, Yellowstone Lake is not the only item on our conservation agenda, but it is one that the council as a whole has taken on as a statewide agenda item. So, Yellowstone Cutthroat Trout. I want to ask a question before I get started. How many of you fished Yellowstone Lake, Yellowstone River more than 7-8 years ago? You know, at least half of you have done it. You guys that fished it more than 7-8 years ago, if you've been back in the last 7-8 years, you know personally from firsthand experience what's happened. Those of you who didn't fish it more than 7 or 8 years ago, you really missed something. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what you missed and what's happening up there right now. I want to talk about the Yellowstone cutthroat as a species first, though. This is a map of the historic range of the Yellowstone cutthroat trout, and for this discussion and in this presentation, the Snake River cutthroat trout, which this is the habitat down here, and the Yellowstone cut are considered the same critter. Yellowstone cuts over here, Snake River cuts down here. That's what it was historically. By the way, to put it in perspective, here's the Bighorn Mountain Range, here's the Wind River Range. You know, this is the Absaroka Beartooth Front in here. And of course, this is the thoroughfare area, there's Yellowstone Lake. Today, the range of those 2 fish, the Snake River cut and the Yellowstone cut, are roughly 43% of their historic range. So they're in a bit of trouble throughout the range. You can see in the Bighorn Mountain Range, they were almost wiped out, just a few remnant populations. A lot of loss down here in the Winds as well. Huge loss up here in the Clark's Fork of the Yellowstone, except for some of the higher tributaries. Even within that 43%, in about a third of that, they're significantly hybridized with rainbow trout. So the loss is even greater than what is shown here. But I want to focus in on this area right here. That's Yellowstone National Park. And it's critical because at one time Yellowstone Lake was thought to be secure. It was thought to be the area that was going to not be impacted by climate change. It's a huge watershed at high elevation, cold water system. There weren't rainbows in that system, so they weren't going to be hybridized, at least not down here in the lakeside. Up here in the Lamar River system, there were some rainbows and there's some hybridization going on up there. but that was thought to be a pretty secure population, and I'll talk about the size of that population in a minute. Well, Yellowstone Lake, I'm sure everybody's seen that. I put this slide in here because I'm taking this presentation to Colorado. There's someone over in Idaho doing it. We're up into Montana. Basically anybody who will listen to us, and some of our audience has never seen Yellowstone Lake, don't realize how big it is. It's the largest freshwater lake above 7,000 feet in North America. 110 miles of shoreline, average depth 139 feet, deepest spot is at least 390 feet. Very important when we start talking about lake trout in a little bit. Absolutely gorgeous place, not only for tourists, but also for us as anglers. I consider, and I think everyone considers, that there's one ecosystem from the brink of Yellowstone Falls, upstream, through Lahardie Rapids, to the lake, through the lake, into the upper Yellowstone River, the Thoroughfare River. All those tributaries that dump into Yellowstone Lake are considered one ecosystem. They depend upon each other. Those fish move back and forth between those tributaries, between the river and the lake. So it's that entire ecosystem that is at risk. Well, fishing has been part of the Yellowstone National Park experience since before it was a park. This is, believe it or not, a picture from 1871, and these guys are out fishing on the lake. And that was 1897. You know, they certainly had their limit. Gluttony was pretty much uncontrolled in the early days. You kept what you caught, and as these guys did, some people kept a huge number of fish. Well, way into the 1950s and beyond, the fishing was incredible. This is Yellowstone River, Yellowstone Lake version of combat fishing. If you've ever been up on where the Russian River dumps into the Kenai, that's what it looks like up there. Well, we had that same sort of experience back in the 50s along the Yellowstone River above Fishing Bridge. That's Fishing Bridge right there. The fishing persisted well into the 1990s. It was fantastic. It was unbelievable. This is a buddy of mine who used to make a trip every single summer to be on that river on opening day, July 15th. And he loved to fish an area that many of you are probably familiar with. This is Cascade Picnic area, on down around the corners of Buffalo Ford, very famous area along the river. He would come out, the fishing was just phenomenal. I used to drive up, I was living in Arizona during the mid-1980s, and I'd drive all the way up here just to fish that river. It was incredible. Well, this is the species we're talking about, the Yellowstone Cutthroat Trout. An absolutely gorgeous fish, differentiated a bit from the Snake River cutthroats, some believe by the size of the spots on the fish. The spawning runs of this population had to be seen to be believed. If any of you got into any of those backcountry tributaries of Yellowstone Lake back in the 1970s or 1980s or even into the early, mid, and even late 1990s, the spawning runs were something to behold. Rumor had it you could walk across some of those tributaries on the backs of the fish. Well, that probably is an exaggeration, but not by much. It wasn't just a fishery, though. The tourists used to come to Lahardie Rapids, and that's where this picture was taken, just to watch these fish leaping up the rapids. And if you were there during the spawning time, early in the summer, early June, you probably saw this yourself. The cutthroats would be stacked along the bank, resting in those little pools. They'd make a run and leap up Lahardie Rapids. Well, at one time, there were estimated to be between 3.5 and 4 million individual Yellowstone cuts in that ecosystem. Again, from the brink of the falls, up through the lake and into the tributaries. Today, we don't know what the remaining population is, but certainly, it's no more than 10% of that number. Many people estimate that it's 5% or less of what it used to be. I mentioned the ecosystem. The Yellowstone cutthroat in that ecosystem was called the keystone species for the ecosystem because there were so many other animals that depended upon that fish, that depended upon the cutthroat as part of their diet. Not exclusively, but as part of their diet. All of those species have now been impacted. In fact, there's some discussion now that the grizzly bear may actually be targeting elk calves more commonly in the spring when they used to be targeting Yellowstone cutthroats in those tributaries. And so that may be at least some portion of the decline of the elk population. Well, I want to talk about the Clear Creek weir, and in a minute you'll understand why, but this weir was built on Clear Creek. Some of you may know where Clear Creek is. It's in the backcountry on the kind of the east side of Yellowstone Lake, accessible off the Sylvan Pass Road. Clear Creek was kind of a benchmark stream. They built this weir in the 1940s to not only count the number of fish that were going up Clear Creek, but also it served as a point where they were collecting the eggs and the sperm from those fish who were going up to spawn, and those were used as breeding stock in the hatchery systems. In fact, here in Wyoming, our cutthroats are from that population. Every spring they would go in and count the number of fish that were going up Clear Creek. And this is a graph of the numbers of cutthroat trout going up just one spawning tributary from way back in the 1970s until the last data point that we have, which is 2008. And you can see that they peaked back in here. They were running as high as 70,000, averaging probably more like 50,000 was kind of the average during this time period. And then the decline started. A decline that perhaps has multiple reasons, but certainly got worse and worse. And in fact, the last 3 years data that they have, there were less than 500 from 50,000 that went up Clear Creek. That weir, by the way, blew out in 2008, has not yet been rebuilt, but they tell us it will be rebuilt this summer. That gives you an idea of the scope of the problem. Well, what are the factors impacting Yellowstone cutthroat trout survival in the lake? There are actually three that most scientists believe are important. Lake trout predation, which I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about. Whirling disease and drought, which I won't spend much time talking about, because most of the scientists, the biologists that study this system believe that overwhelmingly the impact of lake trout predation is far, far superior to the other two factors. Not that they're not important, they are, but they're much less important than lake trout predation. July 30th, 1994, that's kind of a date that's etched into my brain. I can remember it very well. I owned Absaroka Mountain Lodge outside the east side of the park at that time, and I remember it being announced that they had officially recognized a lake trout having been caught in the lake. Was that the first lake trout? Heck no. Lots of people will tell you they caught lake trout way before that. I'm sure they did. When were they planted? I don't know. No one knows. But certainly by 1994 there was an established population because they started to catch them. And this is our culprit. This is the lake trout. The largest lake trout taken out of that system to date is 30 pounds. There have been a number of them over 20. This one was, if I remember right, about 20. And the impact of lake trout is believed by the scientists to be far greater than the impacts of whirling disease and drought combined. Even though whirling disease had a big impact on Pelican Creek, and somebody always brings that up, Pelican Creek. Yes, whirling disease had a major impact on Pelican. Well, there's our lake trout again. The impact of the lake trout is simply that they're eating their way through the Yellowstone cutthroat population. Lake trout are extremely efficient and aggressive predators. These two lake trout are 18 inches long and 23 inches long, yet each one of them had 3 Yellowstone cutthroats in its belly when it was opened up. In fact, it's reported that an adult lake trout can consume, if they're available, as many as somewhere around 40, maybe even a few more cutthroat a year. Well, the park didn't just sit around and do nothing. Soon after the lake trout were officially reported, they began a gill netting effort, and I want to make sure that we give due credit to that because it's an extremely expensive operation, extremely labor intensive. They started out with one boat back in the mid-1990s. They added this boat, the Freedom, I'm not sure what year, but several years ago. And we're spending roughly $500,000 a year on that effort. Not a trivial effort at all. A couple of years back, a contract netter called the Hickey Brothers. They're out of Door County, Wisconsin. That contractor was hired to go up and supplement the efforts of the Park Service. The Hickey Brothers now has 2 boats out on the lake. This is one of their boats called the Sheep's Head, which I'll talk more about in a minute. So there are now 4 boats out on that lake, essentially every day in the summertime, trying to suppress the number of lake trout that are on it. They're doing it by netting operations. They spend close to, in fact, this coming summer, the cost will be over $1 million. It'll be closer to $1.5 million this summer spent on netting. Well, gill netting is an extremely labor-intensive operation. I don't know if any of you have been involved in gill netting. Kevin, I'm sure, has. You get out there and spend a day picking those fish out of those gill net. That twine is very fine. It cuts the heck out of your fingers. At the end of the day, you'd rather do anything else than pick some of those slimy old lake trout out of that gill net. And these folks do it day after day after day. I can't give them credit enough. They set literally miles of gill net. In fact, the Park Service on any given day has about 11 miles of gill net in the water. The Hickey Brothers netting is on top of that. This is a new tool in the arsenal that the Hickey Brothers brought to the struggle. This is a trap net. And in order to understand why a trap net's important, you have to understand how gill net works. Gill nets trap fish by their gills, and it kills them. It's a lethal netting operation unless you can get to that net quick enough and get them out of there without injury. But if you let that net soak for any length of time, the vast majority of the fish are dead. So you can't go set gill nets where there are a lot of remaining cutthroats in the lake, because if you do, you get bycatch of the species you're trying to save. And in fact, that has been a problem throughout the gill netting operation, the bycatch of the cutthroats. The Hickey Brothers brought trap nets in. These trap nets are a live netting operation. They consist of wings that come out here, and this is not drawn to scale. These wings are 300 meters long, up to 300 meters long. They funnel the fish into what's called the heart of the net, then through a tunnel into the pot of the net. Fish are then trapped live in the pot. The whole pot is picked up out of the water. The cutthroats are taken out of the pot and released. The lake trout are bonked on the head and disposed of. This is very important because now they can set these nets in shallow where those cutthroats are at. And if you go out there with sonar and watch, you can actually see the schools of cutthroat. There still are schools of cutthroat. And underneath them, you see the big images, which are the lake trout, waiting underneath them, feeding them. So you can drop a trap net into that area, capture both species, and sort. So it is very, very important. This is what a trap net looks like in the water. These are the wings of the net going out here. This is the heart and the pot back in here. Well, this is where they actually set some of the trap nets in 2001, and you'll see that majority of those trap nets were set here along the west or southwest side of the lake and over in the west thumb